let's go ahead and get started. We're going to continue on with the Didache in chapter 2. So the sheets are the same as last week. We'll get as far as we can this week. No longer than chapter 4, because that's as far as our handout goes. Last week we introduced the Didache, this late first century work of church order, and we looked at the first chapter, which starts off describing there are two ways, one of life and one of death, and then it goes into the first commandment, loving the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, and strength, and our neighbor as ourselves. And do y'all remember where a lot of the content from that first chapter was from? Where was the author borrowing a lot of what he was saying? The Sermon on the Mount, that's right. Yeah, so a lot of it was from the Sermon on the Mount, but also a few other things there. We're going to see that this next chapter, is borrowing a lot from the Ten Commandments. So chapter 2, the second commandment, gross sin forbidden. And the second commandment of the teaching, you shall not commit murder, you shall not commit adultery, and that's from, of course, Exodus 20, 13, and 14. You shall not commit pederasty. That's the technical term for a man having sexual relations with a youth, a male youth. You shall not commit fornication. Again, that's a catch-all term for sexual immorality. You shall not steal, and that's, of course, from Exodus 20:15. You shall not practice magic. You shall not practice witchcraft. You shall not murder a child by abortion, nor kill that which is begotten. And we'll talk about what those things looked like in the ancient world in just a bit. You shall not covet the things of your neighbor, Exodus 20:17. You shall not forswear yourself. Forswearing is to perjure oneself. You shall not bear false witness. You shall not speak evil. You shall bear no grudge. You shall not be double-minded nor double-tongued, for to be double-tongued is a snare of death. Your speech shall not be false nor empty, but fulfilled by deed. You shall not be covetous nor rapacious, which means greedy or given to extortion, nor a hypocrite, nor evil disposed, nor haughty. You shall not take evil counsel against your neighbor. You shall not hate any man, but some you shall reprove. Concerning some you shall pray, and some you shall love more than your own life. Okay, so let's, before we kind of open it up, let's just talk about a few things here. It said here, you shall not commit pederasty. That older men preying upon older boys or very young men, that was a very common thing in the ancient world. It was considered among the Greek pagans a pretty socially acceptable thing, especially if the boy was a slave and the adult was a nobleman. And of course, the church was always against this, right? This is not the way you treat your neighbor. This is not the way that, this is not proper sexuality, biblically speaking. It also mentions here, murder a child by abortion, nor kill that which is begotten. Sometimes you'll hear folks today say that the abortion debates never happened in the church until the 1970s. That is an absolute lie. This is late first century. And why is this a thing? Well, because already by then it was being done. And particularly what was often happening was if you've already got, among the nobility, if you've already got your heir and you've got a couple of spares, you really don't need another one, especially if maybe this wasn't your wife or this, something like that, right? Who's bearing you this other child. That was not uncommon. It was often induced by partaking of herbs that would make a miscarriage happen. And in terms of killing that which is begotten, it was very common in the ancient Roman world to take babies that you did not want and leave them out in the elements to die or to be consumed by creatures. They call this death by exposure, exposing babies. That was super common in late antiquity. And the ones who were usually left were little girls because you wanted boys, you didn't want little girls. That was very common. The church often would go find these babies left out to die, rescue them, adopt them, raise them as themselves, to the point that at one time there comes this major disparity in the pagan Roman world where you've got all these young men but no daughters for them to marry. But the church has all the daughters. So there would be a kind of missionary dating because there's no other way to find a girl. And so the church grew as these young men entered the church hoping to find a wife and then ended up getting converted. Very common thing happening in the ancient world. And the church does indeed condemn both of these things and tries to save those that they can at the time. In terms of the question in the early church of when did they consider life beginning, they usually would say, well, once you can feel that baby, we know it's alive. They didn't know anything else, right? Because they weren't, biology was not super well known, especially things that you could not directly observe. So, but we do see that they said when we know that child is alive, the church says you don't kill it. And you certainly don't kill those that are already born, unlike the way the pagans were. So that's one of the things that gets condemned here. Let's open it up. I mean, a lot of the rest of this is straight from biblical texts, but I wanted to specifically talk about both of those things because they maintain being a bit hot button issues today. Dial.
Does this thing mean that all positions are condemned?
So those illusionists with the top hat do get condemned. No, they don't. No. Yeah, they are talking about kind of sorcery and that sort of thing, witchcraft, sorcery. Yeah, and what's magic largely look like in the ancient world? The point of magic is that you are trying to manipulate the forces, whatever those forces are. Maybe it's the gods, maybe it's forces of nature, maybe whatever. You're trying to manipulate them for your good. But is that the way that Christians try to get what they want? No. No. The Christian trusts God to provide. The Christian trusts God to be in control. But witchcraft, magic in the ancient world was all about trying to assume control yourself. And that's not the way we do things.
Thinking of St. Augustine, his kind of long-term code with like really wanting to get into horoscopes and that kind of thing. That included as part of magic, like a more oracular divination.
Yeah, and what level does divination play into this in the ancient world? It's a little bit fuzzy, to be perfectly honest, because there were definitely a lot of Christian teachers that said, you know, looking at horoscopes, that's just witchcraft in another name. Astrology is just witchcraft in another name. Interestingly, sometime even as recently as the time of the Reformation, there were people that thought of astrology as a serious science, and we had, and so there were Christian philosophers who thought, well, of course the stars can tell the future because God says in the Old Testament that they were given for times. That's why the stars were there. So there was the debate as to where astrology and that sort of thing plays into it was still live pretty recently into early modernity. But by and large, divination was not smiled upon in the Christian world. And why is that? Well, because it's pretty clearly condemned in the Old Testament, right? So that's where that comes from. But yeah, there were a few areas that today we would look at as being gross superstition that some of them at that time were still thinking was more science than magic. Yeah.
So I guess I'm thinking about
Yeah, his divination cup, Joseph's divination cup.
this is where I did
Yeah.
divination. So, like, was that just something from Egypt that was what he was doing, or he was just playing tricks on his brothers, or
Yeah, that's a really good question. What about Joseph and his cup back in Genesis for the recording? Um, and the general opinion that I've read today, but this is frankly a very modern opinion. I don't know what the early church would have thought about this in their cultural context. But most of the time, what you do read today is, oh, Joseph was, being part of the Egyptian culture. He had this thing, and this was the thing he was going to use to kind of get his brothers in that scheme, test his brothers and whatnot. And of course, someone as righteous as Joseph would never practice divination. I think if we're going to be just historically honest, maybe, maybe. But I do think that we should be pretty clear that yes, superstitious activity of whatever sort is not something that a Christian should be involved in. Um, but we do have to acknowledge that just historically, where that line from superstition is a little fuzzy sometimes. Yeah. Notice at the end here, we have a lot of things related to keeping your word, to fulfilling what you say. That's a really big, important part of all this. And we do see, again, this is pretty countercultural because most cultures, even among some of the early Christians, there was this kind of idea that, well, there's a righteous kind of deception. This wily way to trick your enemies is a good thing. But that doesn't seem to be what the church was actually teaching, even if people were believing that, right? So we see that being a person of your word is really, really important to the early church here. And look at the last bit here. Do not take evil counsel against your neighbor. Do not hate any man. So there's this looking at what's going on inside your heart, right? But then there's these other things. Isaiah.
So regarding the aspect of I think at one point I actually attributed to yesterday ago. He said like, hey, like under these circumstances, why are you appropriate to tell lies? I think that like modern scenario given like that Holocaust, they're saying like you have to use your house. It's like well the heart behind the law like don't lie. It's like protect the truth, right? And, like not to do wrong, but in that instance, some of the truth is pretty hard. I guess how would you say like what would you say relates to that?
Yeah, so for the recording, the question is about, are there circumstances where lying or deception is permitted? And the example given was, Augustine mentions this in I think this is in his Confessions. And the example, huh? And Bonhoeffer goes through similar reasoning regarding his context in the Holocaust. Yeah, I think we do see there are times when there aren't good choices, and you have to kind of choose what's a lesser evil. And it's certainly a lesser evil to lie to the Nazis to protect those Jewish people than to well, I got to be a person of my word. Here, go take these innocent folks away and kill them. I mean, like that, and that's one of those things where when we have the mind of Christ, our reason actually helps us out in that, right? Like that situation should be obvious to anybody that's trying to think with the mind of Christ. The midwives in Exodus, yep. Rahab and the spies, things like that, yeah. So we have biblical precedent, right? Yeah. So yeah, that's true.
One kind of on that, one thing that makes that very different from public speaking here is that they did not lie necessarily for personal gain. You might say that they have case, for presume that putting that risk something that wasn't just like
Yeah. The deception in those cases, again, for the recording, is not for selfish reasons, but it's to protect to protect others, particularly in life-changing situations. So that's, but I would also say that's not the same thing as when the mob boss says, "Oh, you're going to be a rat, are you?" It's not the same situation, right? So, but again, we can take our reason to this and understand the biblical text that way, not in terms of a legalistic approach. Father.
One of the things that Tim Keller points out on this as well is that there are certain people qualified. And so we withhold the truth from that person in the sense of not casting pearls. And that's a wisdom thing, and he says you want to be really careful about it, be judgmental about who gets the truth and who doesn't. But in its trueness in those situations where we are protecting the innocent from someone who is doing evil. And he actually, if I remember right, there's something to akin of the difference between killing and murder. And so we will kill someone in self-defense of the innocent, and there's precedent for that within Christian ethics.
Yeah.
Though we would say that was not a choice that we would want to make, but this person has made the choice to sacrifice their life on doing evil. We had to execute justice. And so the same thing can be said about withholding the truth or telling a lie. No, there are no Jews here. And then then you quickly flip to your Bible and say, in Christ there are no Jews. There are no
Oh, that's messed up. But I so not repeating all that for the recording. But but I do think that the emphasis in what you just said there, Father Zach, about how justice plays into this, biblical justice, is huge. It is not just to turn someone in so they can be murdered by evil men. It's not just to it's not just to let a murderer live so that your hands are clean from blood. Like that, those things are not just. So yeah, that's a really good point, and very much plays into Old Testament ethics and New Testament ethics. But particularly in terms of Old Testament ethics, justice really is the thing. It's not about legalistic adherence to rules of and laws. It is about having a just society, something that was not common in the ancient world, where might makes right. And I would point out that for all of its faults, Rome understood this a lot better than most other ancient civilizations. Rome was, by and large, Roman courts were generally considered to be a good place to have to be tried. So let's get into the third chapter. I don't think we'll make it through the fourth, but that's okay. Other sins forbidden. So this is miscellaneous parts of the way to death. My child, flee from every evil thing and from every likeness of it. Be not prone to anger, for anger leads the way to murder. Where are they getting that from? Yeah, again, the Sermon on the Mount, from what Jesus said, right? Neither jealous, nor quarrelsome, nor of hot temper, for out of all these murders are engendered. My child, be not a lustful one, for lust leads the way to fornication. Neither a filthy talker, nor of lofty eye. What's lofty eye? Pride. That's right. That's pride. I should have put that one in a footnote. So neither a filthy talker nor of lofty eye, for out of all these adulteries are engendered. Let's put a bookmark there, because we're going to have to ask, why does filthy talking and pride lead to adultery? My child, be not an observer of omens. Okay, there's your divination, right? Be not an observer of omens, since it leads the way to idolatry. Neither an enchanter, nor an astrologer, nor a purifier. In this context, it's like a pagan ritual purification. Nor be willing to look at these things, for out of all these idolatry is engendered. My child, be not a liar, since a lie leads the way to theft. Neither money-loving, nor vainglorious. Vainglory is excessive elation or pride over one's own achievements, so being boastful kind of vanity. For out of all these thefts are engendered. My child, be not a murmurer, since it leads the way to blasphemy. Neither self-willed nor evil-minded, for out of all these blasphemies are engendered. But be meek, since the meek shall inherit the earth. And again, that's from the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5:5. Be long-suffering and pitiful and guileless and gentle and good and always trembling at the words which you have heard. You shall not exalt yourself, nor give overconfidence to your soul. Your soul shall not be joined with lofty ones, but with just and lowly ones shall it have its intercourse. The workings that befall you receive as good, knowing that apart from God, nothing comes to pass. So there's all sorts of miscellany here. Some of it very, very interesting, and we could probably spend a half an hour on this chapter itself. But we see certain things are pretty obvious in there. It leads to this, it leads to that. We already see from the Sermon on the Mount that temper, jealousy, being prone to anger, quarrelsomeness, out of those murders are engendered. And of course, Jesus says, you've committed murder in your heart with a lot of these things, right? Filthy speech and lofty eye, the prideful eye, it says that leads to adultery. How's that work?
So what constitutes filthy speech in the ancient context? Is it
I'm-
different now? Is it similar?
I'm not sure. I mean, I would think I would think that when they're speaking of filthy speech, it is just things that are dirty jokes, unseemliness, stuff like that. And there were some of the early church fathers were just like, I don't know about that humor and laughing thing. That's flirting with dirty speech, right? Is Chaucer filthy speech? Oh, well, some of that maybe. Yes.
I asked kind of about that because you were saying like, okay, like the window and facing humor and that kind of thing. I could see how that would then pair with filthy that.
Yeah, so there is a kind of joking that's inherently a little flirting with lust already. Yeah, that's true. That's true, and we see that very much in every society ever. It's just part of the human condition. Um,
In regards to the eye part,
yeah. How's that lofty eye lead?
I think Leah's spouse that he's like engaged to like one spouse, pretty humble, like realize for like wives, partners, and so if you are like prideful, say well like I deserve more, like or like you're not good enough. He's not acting appropriately towards those neighbors that like somehow like out of respect.
So for the recording, it does indeed take humility to be in a good Christian marriage, in a good biblical marriage. And yeah, I think you're right that there is a tendency to think you deserve more than what the Lord's given you, regarding your spouse or things like that. Why is it that the rich and powerful are almost nobody expects them to have a faithful marriage? A lot of times that's very common. Whether you're a celebrity or a politician, oh yeah, you just can't expect that. Well, yes, you can, right? But that pride can lead to a sense of entitlement, including entitlement to other people's wives or to things outside of marriage. Yeah.
Think about the values, like there's, hey, here's the confines for your parents, well, breaking down places, everybody would say, hey, that's not an appropriate place to make that joke, appropriate place to talk like that. But you push just a little bit farther and go outside the arm of what's socially environment.
So the prideful man feels that he can, or the prideful woman feels that she can break those boundaries that help keep things, whether they're social boundaries or ethical boundaries. Yeah, I think that's a thing too. Yeah, the rules don't apply to me. right? And that can lead to adulteries. So when we're back to that issue of divination and superstition, we'll just throw it under the category of superstition. We're saying, okay, or the Didache is saying, that's the slippery slope to idolatry. And I think that's really where the church has tended to see a lot of those things. And I would say also at the Reformation, why do they have so many problems with what's going on in the Roman Catholic world at the time? Okay, we hear the theological argument from Rome to show how this isn't idolatry, but this looks a lot like idolatry. Your superstitions look like idolatry to everybody. So we see that superstition does pave the way to idolatrous practices. And what's the thing going on there in the heart? You're not trusting God. Hey, I can't trust God's going to help me sell my house. I need to go pray to St. Joseph, get a statue of him, bury him upside down. That's going to sell my house. I mean, that's we see that that's a very, very San Antonio kind of superstition, right? Oh gosh, I'll never, this problem's happening. I better, go, whatever. I mean, we all know how this goes, right? And a lot of superstitions, not just ones related to another denomination, have this same problem. We're not trusting God. And that's what it says at the end, right? The workings that befall you receive as good, knowing apart from God nothing comes to pass. Randy.
You touched on something there too. It got my attention about, I can try and justify maybe something. How do other people see the appearance?
Yeah, and that comes from the very beginning part, right? Yeah, don't just flee from evil, but from the likeness of evil. Because you might be pulling your brother down with what you're doing. Yeah, that's good, Randy. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there. Yeah. All right, well, we are at 11 o'clock. We may touch on a couple things from chapter 4, but next week we'll get into chapter 3. Next week we'll get into chapter 4. I'll probably bring the next printout as well with chapter 5 and on. I will not be printing 1 through 4 again, so hang on to your copy, and there's a few extras in the back as well. So God bless y'all.